I'm Tony Ruiz, contributing editor at Gold Derby, here with Daniel Minahan, the executive producer and director of Fellow Travelers. And Dan, we've talked before, and I know your work, pretty well. And I think it's fair to say, if I may use a sports analogy, that you kind of left it all out on the field with this one. I feel like this project of Fellow Travelers really, you poured everything into it. Would that be kind of a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it's a fair assessment. I felt like I could bring a lot to this project when Ron and Robbie came to me and sent me the scripts. I recognized right away like I had a lot to offer on this one.
Well, talk me through what was behind the decision to only direct the first two. Had you thought about directing the whole thing, or was it just a scheduling thing that only led to the first two?
I would have loved to have directed all of them. I had a commitment to work on a movie right up against it. So what I did was I flew up to Toronto with Ron, started setting everything up, hired all of our creatives, found locations, and found the rest of the cast together, and then jumped right in. Um, we were lucky enough to get really great directors for the rest of the blocks, and I kept a foot in and watched cuts and watched dailies, and yeah, it was an amazing experience. I feel like everybody that we had on it brought something special to it.
Well, and those first two episodes to me, and I feel like I've read this in other interviews that you've done. You really wanted there to be kind of this cohesive look and tone that kind of blanketed the whole series. Is that right?
Yeah, when given the opportunity to set up a show like this, I think you want to be able to make it instantly recognizable, for a viewer. And one of the things that was really important to me is that although we were doing a period piece, I wanted it to be completely accessible, emotionally. That was the most important thing. We weren't going to make it as if we were making an old-fashioned movie. I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted it to feel contemporary. And the story itself is so relevant to today that I wanted people to be able to go, oh my God, that's what's happening now.
Right. And I feel like one of the important things about the series was that this could just be a period piece and it could just be like a chronicle of queer history, but it's also got to be narratively and dramatically a compelling story in and of itself. So, how do you thread that needle?
I think you thread the needle by finding the truth of every single scene and making it a great heartfelt love story. I think it's incredibly moving, the end of the first hour when, Hawk is left sitting, waiting for Tim to call on the phone and watching this sort of parade of gay life in San Francisco in the 1980s. And he sees the life that he could have had and missed out on. So I think it's just finding the guts of every single scene. And luckily, we had the most brilliant scripts, the most capable cast, and all the toys you could imagine. Just the most beautiful sets and costumes, and we just let it fly.
Well, and I want to talk about those sets and costumes because I've talked to Anastasia, I've talked to Joseph, I'm curious as to, I mean, when you walk on those sets and you see them, and knowing that this is a part of our history that maybe we've only seen in books or only encountered from a third hand. Is there something kind of surreal about stepping onto those sets and going, "Whoa, this is like our history"?
Yeah, I think, especially the Senate and the State Department. Like, I've never been to the State Department, but I have visited the Senate when I worked on House of Cards and the White House. But the thing about Washington is that it doesn't really change a lot. These are big, beautiful, famous buildings. The challenge we had was to create Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Fire Island in Toronto, which is very much its own kind of thing and doesn't have a lot of old architecture. So everything you see there was built by our incredible production designer and art department. Um, that was one of the, really important things to me. And I feel like we really delivered it. But we had a kind of a mantra, which was, it's sort of, it's sort of like we didn't want to do the postcard version of Washington and San Francisco. It was like, we live here, it's no big deal. And we wanted to kind of tell it in offhanded ways. You see the Capitol building looming in the distance at night. Um, you see the tracks of the tram, of the streetcars in San Francisco, and the colorful Victorian buildings, but you don't. We're not going for the the usual expected things, and we're showing Lafayette Park, but we're showing the dark, seedy cruising side of it.
And then you also have these wonderful interiors like of the club, um, which I found every one of those scenes just so, it's like watching history, but it's also again watching a story.
I think the Cozy Corner, which was a real place in DC in the 50s, that was frequented by, mostly Black, gay, and lesbian people. The clubs were, at that time, there were clubs were integrated, although it was not enforced. So we kind of found this very romantic, created this very romantic version of what that club was, and it was much bigger and grander than the real place. But I feel like Anastasia's idea to make it it was probably a grand supper club in the 1920s that they just broomed everything out and moved in their piano and opened up shop.
Yeah, the love story that's at the heart of this, um, I feel like in lesser hands, probably would have Hawk might have been like defanged a little, like toned down. He's a very complex character and not always an easy character to like. How did you kind of see this guy?
You know, the thing about Hawk's character and the thing that Matt did so beautifully was to make this person who chose this very extreme way of surviving and maintaining his life, creating a family, and a career in Washington in the closet. So he had the advantage of us understanding what he was up against. The romantic story between Hawk and Tim is the backbone of the whole piece, and it's the thing that galvanizes the whole thing. It has a lot of uh, political, it's a big political story, but it's a little bit like The Way We Were, with Robert Redford and Barbara Streisand. Like, it's a very romantic story within a political background.
Yeah, it so much of the relationship between the two of them, it's very much a dance and a very much both of them finding themselves in a way that gives them both empathy because they're, again, like you said, just trying to survive.
Yeah, I think, Tim starts to realize his effect on Hawk and his power, and the power dynamic between them is constantly shifting and changing. And that was something that we were really, really conscious of because they're both people working in politics. The flow of information is power. And that kind of relationship, with an older person and a younger person, there's a big dynamic there, of power. So we tried to thread that through every scene, and I think that that's kind of what made it really compelling. And these otherwise rough around the edges characters, very empathetic.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I recall even when I was speaking to Ron about this, that even somebody like Roy Cohn, um, while you don't necessarily sympathize with him, there is a certain amount of humanity there that maybe has been dwarfed by his reputation.
Yeah, the casting of McCarthy and Cohn was really important to me, and I called on my old friend Chris Bauer, who I'd known for years, who's an incredibly established actor, theater, film, and series, because I knew that I wanted a McCarthy who was very charismatic and sexy to people, because the real McCarthy was that, I mean, he was a demagogue. He had the people in his sway. He was also like a very sexual person, and carried himself in a, he kind of had a swagger about him that I knew Chris could bring to it. And Will Brill, who plays Roy Cohn, just has an earthiness to him that was against type, that I think made our Roy, our very brutal Roy Cohn somehow have like a human edge. I'm talking to you from Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is this sort of artist colony and gay community where Roy Cohn lived in the 70s and 80s, and he was a man who was out in the world, but completely closeted to the day that he died, as a gay man. And I think in a way that humanizes him as much as he's a despicable character.
Um, you know, so much has been made of the sex in the show, but what I appreciate about it is that it is always at the center of it. It is about the relationship between these two people. It's not sex for sex sake. And frankly, I wish we weren't talking about it, because you don't necessarily talk about it with straight relationships, but it's still a factor. That's another needle that you had to thread, I would assume.
Yeah, the sex scenes were really important, and it was always our intention that each of the sex scenes moved the story forward and moved the relationship forward. And each of the sex scenes, as I said, was an exchange of power between the two men. And so that was really important. But the other thing is, you had to express their sexuality, because that was the thing that put them at risk in every way in both stories. In the story of the 1950s, that's the thing that they were hiding, their love for each other. In the 1980s, it's the thing that they're fighting for. They're fighting for their lives and their sexuality, the ability to be yourself. So yeah, I think it was important, and it's provocative to see, but it's also integral to the plot. So I feel good about it.
Yeah, I one of the things that I talked with Ron and I talked with Johnny about is the fact that you know this show in many ways is going to do things for young queer people who, for people of our generation, we grew up not seeing this type of thing. And so I'm wondering what young Dan would have, how young Dan would have responded to a show like this. Um,
I mean, listen, as growing up as a queer kid, you find images and clues wherever you can. I went to the library, went through After Dark magazine, which was an entertainment magazine that was clearly edited by gay people, Interview magazine, any little clue. I think there was a TV series called Soap when I was a kid, and there was a gay character on it, and it was
that was
really,
Billy Crystal.
yeah, Billy Crystal, and it was really significant for me. So, you know, one of the things that I think the series really puts across is this idea that gay people and queer people always find each other. And I hope that, it's important for young people who are looking to understand their history and to just recognize themselves in film and television.
Particularly, and I think it's even more relevant now when so many forces are trying to edit history itself, but particularly edit queer history, and discount it.
As we were shooting this, there were a number of bills and legislation, to roll back gay rights and restrict gay rights, that was happening in real time as we were filming this. And we would look, we'd go to each other and say, look at this headline. Can you believe this is crazy? And, it was unfortunately became very topical even as we were filming it.
So you look back at, so when you you're working on a feature. This is your first feature in about 20 years. Am I right?
Well, yeah, if you don't count the Deadwood movie, but
Which I do.
okay, good. So that's a few, there's like one in between. I, I found myself working in series and loving it. And I love um, working with great writers. And I've been really lucky to be able to collaborate with, some of the best from Alan Ball and David Benioff, Dan Weiss and David Milch and everybody in between. Like I've really been able to, and now we're on Nice Wanner, so yeah, I kind of got into a groove with it, and I'm working on finishing a film now, and loving it. You know,
Does does being as involved in a project like this, because you were saying you started in episodic television, kind of like as a director for hire, does kind of pouring yourself into a project like this, and Halston and Johnny Versace and all those types of projects, does it make it a little bit harder to even think about doing just regular episodic television, or now you have like you want to put your stamp on this?
yeah, it's important to me now that I'm able to originate things and whenever possible direct the entire series. I mean, I've been working as a producer and director now for, as a producing director now for like the last 8 years, I think. So it would be hard to go back to as a day player, but you know, it's very gratifying to be able to build something from the ground up with a showrunner and see it come to life.
Well, and I've said this to everybody else connected with this show, but I hope you know that this is something that's going to live forever. This project is something that's going to live forever, and it's going to mean a lot to a lot of young queer kids.
Well, that means a lot. That's a beautiful thing to hear. I hope that's true. And I just hope people are out there and able to find it and enjoying it. It's a hard one to watch, I think, all at once. I don't recommend binging it, but each one has its own kind of a gut punch, and it's just so rich and textured. And yeah, I hope it has staying power and means a lot to people.
Well, everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders in the coming weeks. Dan Minahan, always good to see you. Thank you so much.
It's good to see you.